So, Spotlight has, of course, won several Oscars, deservedly. And I wanted to just comment on this movie, which I found really fascinating and really do recommend. It certainly deserves the acclaim it's been getting and the awards it received. Uh, it is certainly reminiscent of All the President's Men. In fact, there was a point when I saw the name Ben Bradley in the film, and I thought, oh, that's an homage to All the President's Men. In point of fact, there really was an editor named Ben Bradley who was the son of the Ben Bradley who was around during the Watergate scandal. So that's one of those cases where one is almost inclined to see the authorship of God in history, a sign that God is actually a better writer than any screenwriter is. But I want to talk about the film a little bit. The Vatican newspaper, which often gets conflated for the Vatican itself, has said that the film is not anti-Catholic, and it isn't anti-Catholic. But Catholics certainly have to reflect on it and respond to it, especially in the context of Francis's papacy, where Francis, in a recent press conference where certain other comments were more discussed, said that yes, indeed, a bishop needs to resign if he's been involved retroactively in shuffling around pedophilic priests. Now, does that go far enough? Ought he to counsel or even mandate that such bishops turn themselves into the police as accessories after the fact? That's a separate discussion, I think. And in a way, Spotlight is not about that. If there is one thing you kind of say it's missing, it doesn't really speculate as much as it could or document as much as it could what the psychology is of a bishop who would in fact shuffle around priests. What motivation could he have, right? The film depicts Cardinal Law, who appears in a couple of scenes. And in one scene that is laced with dramatic irony, he is speaking to the new editor of the Boston Globe. And he's telling this editor that he was once the editor of a small diocesan paper, and he did something very controversial, which was stand up for civil rights. But he wouldn't, he's proud of it, even though he caught a lot of flack for it. The irony, of course, being that he is, in a sense, encouraging this new editor of the Boston Globe to equally do something very unpopular, which is to stand up against the institutional disease of the church in Boston. But the movie, to its credit, it acknowledges that Cardinal Law was known to be a hero. In fact, there's not only was he an advocate of civil rights long before it was fashionable to be, as were many in the church, many high-ranking officials in the church. The Pope himself met with Martin Luther King Jr. But that even his pastoral ministry in the diocese, in the archdiocese, was well known. He was a very pastoral guy who would stay up late into the night counseling people and going out and doing pastoral visits. And the movie does portray him kind of the way he seems to be in real life. So why then would he be the kind of person who would shuffle around priests? Is it just because he wants to preserve the prestige of the church? Well, the film does seem to be a lot about tribalism. It's more about tribalism, really, than it is about religion, ultimately. The editor of the film, or the editor of the Boston Globe, the one who encourages the Spotlight team to investigate this story, is an outsider. He's an unmarried Jewish guy who doesn't really care for sports, all of which put him sort of outside the camp of Boston culture, which actually it's a lot of people to sort of distance themselves from him and speak of him sort of disparagingly. Now, that's not because it's not anti-Semitic per se, or Catholic elitist. It's sort of because he's not Bostonian. He doesn't like baseball enough or whatever. And the people who defend the church in this movie, a lot of whom, we're not even told whether they're Catholic or not, they defend it because it's a Boston institution. It's their team. And that's more what the movie is about. And it makes the point that it's an outsider, a semi-outsider, someone from outside the village who can kind of expose this thing, which is institutionalized in the village. It makes one think of other cases, or perhaps the BBC looked the other way when it came to Jimmy Savile because he was doing so much good work. He was the greatest philanthropist in history in Britain, objectively speaking. And maybe they thought, well, if he has a few odd sexual proclivities, we can kind of handle that because look at all the good he's doing, otherwise. And that's the same thing as a scene at a charity for children, which is run by Catholic children's hospitals and charities, where a journalist is told, well, why kick this rock over, right? The church does so much good; it's so important, and that's more what it's about. It's about this kind of tribalism, this post-Constantinian tribalism, uh, which makes one think about cases where the church or churchmen have kind of stuck with its own team, maybe, over against its own principles. After the French and American revolutions, for example, there was a lot of monarchist sentiment in the church. Right, there were a lot of denunciations of just liberalism, what was flatly called liberalism. Didn't distinguish between Anglo-American liberalism and kind of European liberalism. Uh, Even though Catholic principles would often lend themselves in some ways more to maybe a more democratic society as opposed to a more oppressive one, or some of these old monarchies weren't even very sympathetic to the church, really. I mean, the French monarchy just used the church in kind of an Erastian, controlling way to prop up its own power. Often the king would disregard the Pope. It was more of a Gallican kind of thing, right? And yet, because the French monarchy, the ancient regime, sort of picked the Catholic Church to be the religion that was going to bolster itself with, well, they were the church's team, and hence some churchmen, Joseph de Maistre and so forth, Louis Bonald, defended that old regime. All right, even if the principles of liberalism and democracy were maybe more in accord with the teaching on the image of God, right, which is something the Vatican, to elucidate it, was willing to admit in documents like Dignitatis Humanae and Gaudium et Spes, kind of accept progress and so forth. But I think part of the reason why the church held on was because it wasn't the right team. It had to stick with its team, with its tribe. And you see something similar going on in Spotlight. People are sticking with the church and defending the church because it's their tribe. But does it go further than that? Did Cardinal Law, who is this great guy in so many respects, I mean, why did he move these priests around? Was it perhaps because of bad theology? Was it because of bad psychology? Was it because there was a thought that, because the way to deal with a pedophile is move them away from the victim and get them counseling and training, and just move them to another parish and it'll get fixed through therapy? Well, because that was somewhat the orthodoxy of the time, and it wasn't just the church who was being advised that way, nor was the church the only institution or organization that kind of followed that kind of advice. The movie does not get into that. In some ways, that's perhaps not what it's about. As I've said, it's more about this tribalism. It isn't anti-Catholic in that sense. Now, it does deal with it touches on a few points, though, that Catholic theology can maybe speak to. So, for example, there's this sort of discussion about the fact that, almost other than the editor, all of these journalists were raised Catholic and have, various degrees of devotion to the church and practice to the church. But they're a bit disenchanted, right? Well, the Mark Ruffalo character says that he always thought he would go back to church someday, but now he never can. Rachel McAdams can't go to church anymore. And the person who's advising them, who's a former priest, says at one point that he still considers himself Catholic even though he doesn't go to Mass anymore, because he says, this is almost a direct quote, well, the church is a human institution that will pass away, right? But the truth will always last. Which is basically the heresy of Joachimism, back from Joachim of Fiore. That there were these sort of three ages, and the human institution of the church was going to pass away in favor of the age of the Spirit, right? Well, I mean, there was a time when the entire episcopacy had abandoned Christ, and was either failing to defend Christ or was actively attacking him and turning him over to his enemies. And what we see in this film is a case where, once again, it's the hierarchy who are failing, who are in the position of the apostles who fled, who fled or have betrayed Christ with a kiss. And in this case, Christ is seen not clearly in his representatives, those who represent him sacramentally, but in the victims of these priests, a couple of whom are interviewed. Disparate personalities, wildly, but all victims. And Christ is seen in them. Right? Christ identifies with them. There's a cruciform way of watching the events of this film. Seeing it as an injustice which Christ has taken upon himself on the cross, or which Christ has descended to share in. And this is something you always have to keep in mind when you think of any of these sexual abuse scandals, any rape or abuse scandals, whether it's John Ghomeshi, or whether it's Bill Cosby, or whether it's the church. You have to remember to see Christ in those victims. And furthermore, what's interesting is that there's this talk, kind of sociologically about the church. For example, the the ex-priest who's talking about the sort of hidden subculture of pedophilia says the problem is celibacy. Now, he doesn't claim that it's because these priests are celibate and therefore they need some sort of outlet for their sexual drive. He doesn't make that preposterous claim, which was refreshing, but he says because there are a lot of priests who violate their vows, usually with other consenting adults, there becomes a kind of culture of covering it up and looking the other way and sort of quietly ignoring other priests' violation of their vows of celibacy, which then extends to covering up cases of pedophilia in his mind. Well, what's interesting is that sort of raises the question of, well, what else is involved with the kind of culture of celibacy? Because, and I don't know if this was intentional by the director, but there's a scene where a lawyer who's involved with trying to bring justice to the situation, and one of the journalists are sort of talking to each other in a diner, and they make the point, they ask each other, are you married? He said, no, I'm too busy. I don't have time to be married. Yeah, me neither. My work is too consuming for me. Kind of interesting. There's a culture of maybe not chastity, but of celibacy, among these other people who are working for justice in a certain sense. And that's not the only interesting analogy you could draw. Another interesting analogy is, all these people, right, were raised Catholic. The film never makes the point, or raises the question, maybe I should say. So where are all these journalists, or the Spotlight team, who are known for these hard-hitting cases? Where did they get their desire for truth and justice? Where did they get their sense that truth will out and crime has to be sort of exposed and remedied and all this? Could it be from their Catholic upbringing? Could it be because they all went to Catholic school and went to church and heard homilies about truth and so forth? In fact, the film actually depicts a homily dealing with truth and faith at one point. Could there be something sociological about Catholicism? There a sociological Catholicism which is positive, which is actually what led to this iteration of sin in the Catholic Church being exposed? That's an interesting question. The film doesn't touch on that, but I think it's an interesting thing to wonder about. But what's really intriguing to me is there's a scene where, after 9/11, when everything has to sort of be put on hold, to of course report on what happened in New York, where there's a lot of frustration and anger and kind of infighting among the reporters about, should we break the story now? And Michael Keaton says, no, not yet, because we don't have quite enough evidence yet, and if we don't come with all cylinders firing, the church will be able to expose those individual cases and maybe not show their individual weakness, and the full force of this will not really be seen. And some people say, no, we've got to expose them. We've got to unleash this evidence now, and it becomes quite heated. And ultimately the decision is made, well, no, let's hold off. Let's not report on these priests until we can prove it. Now, the reason that's interesting to me is because that shows a mentality, right? A psychology whereby someone might know that there is abuse happening, but feels it prudent not to make it public, at least not yet. And this is why I think, I wish the film, or at least maybe a film, should explore this. What was the psychology of the bishops who do or did choose not to let this become public, right? Or maybe another question too is, what if they had settled? There's all this question about these priests who settled privately, right? So as to not cause scandal. What if every time a priest settled privately, the church settled a case privately with a family, every time those priests were then promptly defrocked and sent to a training center and not allowed to ever operate in active ministry ever again? What would the thought of that be? Would people be a little bit more forgiving of the church? Say, okay, well, at least it's dealing with this problem, or even further? No, I don't think they would. They would say, well, no, these people have to go to jail like right away, right? Well, perhaps was the church misguidedly trying to find another solution, one that was healing to both the victims and the priests? Was it that generous? Was it more cynical? Because here's a case where, had things gone differently, I could see the Boston Globe being accused, right? So, supposing some other news agency found out and exposed this and said, well, the Boston Globe knew about this. Why didn't they tell people, right? There's interesting analogies in some ways between these Boston Globe reporters and the people whom they're investigating. Maybe the director intended all these, in which case it's all to his credit. But it's there anyways, and it's all very thought-provoking and very interesting. And challenging to all of us. I know Mark Ruffalo has protested outside a Catholic church, which has led some people to comment that Hollywood is not exactly a bastion. Well, lots of child stars have been abused there, but of course we ought to hold the church to a higher standard than we hold Hollywood. Theologically, Hans Urs von Balthasar was controversial once when he said the church is a chaste whore. It is both pure, it's a virgin mother, and yet simultaneously it is also the whore of Babylon at times. Which was very controversial, but I don't know how you can deny it. There's this paradox that somehow the church is both Christ and contains Judas. Right? Judas is one of the first apostles, first bishops, and yet he was able to successfully cast out demons. Right? He was sacramentally conformed to Christ. This is the scandal of the incarnation, right? Where we have to be willing to kind of even look at ourselves and say, where am I failing to be Christ? Where am I failing to see Christ in others? And in a way, a reminder too, that no matter what, Christ will still always be there, even if he's there only the way he was present in the tomb, or even on the cross. Anyways, I do recommend Spotlight. I encourage you to go see it. It makes a good double pairing with The Big Short, which deals with economic sin, the kind of economic sin that Pope Francis has also been drawing attention to. It's a good Catholic double feature in some ways. A good triple feature maybe with The Revenant, which depicts the spirituality of Laudato Si, and the sacramentality of nature, the ability to, through nature, to find the suffering inherent in nature, seemingly, in fallen nature at least, how it can be sacramental, just as Christ's suffering on the cross was sacramental, and how how that sacramental experience can actually lead one to forgiveness and reconciliation. The Revenant and The Big Short and Spotlight make a good Catholic triple feature. I recommend all of them to you. If you haven't seen them yet, they all deserve the awards and the acclaim they're getting. And that's all for now. Take care.